So I'm now trying to keep moving along, and I'm going to hand over to Barbara Bakey, who's one of our founding members and a member of our steering circle. And she's going to introduce the next session, which is, we have entitled this next session, Women Weaving Opportunities to Redefine Power. Over to you, Barbara.
Thanks very much, Janet, and thank you to Anna Matilda for that beautiful welcome. Really sort of reinforces the importance of why we're here today and what we need to do. My name is Barbara Bakey, and I'm a founding member of the Women's Climate Congress, and absolutely delighted to be here. And also, just for myself, I want to acknowledge the custodians of the land that we're meeting on today, and the lands on where you are meeting. And perhaps if you haven't already, if you'd like to pop in the chat the lands on which you're meeting, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So this is so exciting for day 2. And in our Women's Rising event last November, Lycia Heath, CEO of Women for Election, spoke about her passion to get more women elected from all parties at all levels of government. And she had this to say about redefining power. Think about the current imagery about power. Putin bare-chested on a horse, people saluting in front of an army, people in penis-shaped rockets. That is an imagery of old world white power. And we need to rebrand power. The power that hums is humming away all the time in our communities. Every moment, the power that women show every day in leading their communities. The sort of power that we want to see in the future. Courage, empathy in leadership, providing psychological safety in leadership are all feminized traits. They don't only reside in the feminine world, of course, but it is the power we need if we're going to move forward as a collective with harmony with nature. One of the lines from the Women's Climate Congress values statements also relates to this idea. We assert the qualities of the heart, such as compassion, love, empathy, forgiveness, are the basis of true strength. These human laws must be reactivated if we are to survive. Another line says, weary of conflict and polarisation, we resist judgment and blame. Embrace uncertainty, encourage mediation and collaboration for safe passage from climate chaos to climate survival. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore together these ideas of power and collaboration in the context of WCC values and principles. To get started, we're going to have some short presentation, which we hope will be interspersed with questions from all of you. So make sure you're putting some questions in the chat. And to moderate these presentations and Q&A, it is a great honour to introduce Associate Professor Sara Motter. Associate Professor Sara Motter is a proud Mezzo Salvaggio, and I'm apologising already for my pronunciation, Sarah, and of Columbia Chichachar Musica, Eastern European Jewish Celtic lineages, currently living on the unceded lands of the Alawar and Warramai peoples in New South Wales. She is a mother, storyteller, poet, activist, political theorist, popular educator, and convenes the politics discipline in the University of Newcastle. And sometimes she sleeps. She's an amazing woman. She has worked widely with women leading change in their communities and found that while often invisible, women are at the forefront of political and knowledge change struggles. In her latest books called Liminal Subjects, Weaving Our Liberation, was published in 2018, and she was the winner of 2020 of Best Gender Theory and Feminist book. Sara is also running a project with Michelle Maloney, co-founder of the New Economy Network Australia and Newcastle University School of Business, called Women Weaving the New Economy, Country, Care and Community. Doesn't that sound amazing? So Sara, there's a lot of weaving going on there. In handing over to you to moderate this session and introduce the other speakers, could you share a little bit more about your own thoughts about this theme and why you think this metaphor is important in thinking about how women's leadership can provide opportunities to redefine power? So thank you, and over to you, Sara.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the invitation to be present today and to hold the space of this dialogue. I would like to just honour and acknowledge the ongoing sovereignty and the custodianship of the Awabakal and the Worimi peoples, which is the lands that hold me. I sit at a kind of meeting point of an estuary of salt and fresh waters, and I think water as a metaphor also kind of plays quite strongly into the idea of the possibility of weaving across difference and making connections in unexpected ways that are both depthful and that have grace. I also convocar la energía de mis abuelas para que nos acompañe este día y nos ayudan a encarnar una escucha profunda y una mirada de amor. So in my work, one of the kind of concepts or meaning making that we've tried to develop is around this idea of the feminization of the political, or the political in and as the feminine, which both acknowledges the role of raised and feminized women and kin at the front lines, really, and at the heart of many of the projects that are life-making and that want to contribute to the possibility of life well lived and premised in relationships of care for country, care for self in relationship to country, the recuperation of kind of the knowledges of First Nations peoples and other communities who have been marginalized from both theory making and political power and decision making. In so doing is both to honor the role of women and feminized people and communities, but also to foreground some of the things that Janet was talking about and was brought really present, and I think is something that we're going to explore with some depth in our dialogue today around what does it mean to also reimagine the political? What does it mean to actually reimagine citizenship? What does it mean to reimagine forms of leadership in the feminine and in an intersectional sense of the feminine? So not a form that erases the other, but that builds on the possibilities of richness and pluridiversality through learning about each other's stories and knowledges. And a kind of politics in the feminine, some of the things that have been, I think, are really strong are this idea of care, and care in a multiple sense. So care, to be careful with the other, is to have an attentiveness and to develop a kind of attunement, which involves deep listening, which is a practice here with First Nations communities, which is so powerful, but also with Colombian indigenous communities, escucha profunda. And to have deep listening is a recognition of the importance of the knowledges and the wisdoms that other stories, other women, other lineages bring to our possibility of thinking and weaving and sharing and living together. And so there's something epistemological about care, but it also involved affect and the body, and taking seriously how we create spaces of presence, of deep presence, of our capacity to hold that which is other, to share across our differences, to sit with discomfort as well, not discomfort that seeks to do harm, but discomfort that can unsettle things that we might have taken for granted, but which can become blocks of our capacity to build across difference. And in that caring kind of politics in the feminine of the feminine is also a centering of those voices who have been most marginalized. So First Nations, Black, other colonized, other forms of the feminine who have often been sidelined and have been the subject of multiple dispossessions, of multiple uncaring acts of violation on land and on body. And so I think in holding the space today, this is what I want to try and bring, is that presence and that deep listening, and to try to cultivate, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable, even if it's sometimes unexpected or unsettling, the possibility of that deep listening across the difference that is present with the women who are present today. And then to add in some reflection. So each woman that will speak for around 5 minutes. And then I'm just going to do some reflection back and maybe a question to kind of thread some themes across and hold the space and help weave the space and the presence in that way. And then after we have kind of had that interaction and that dialogue, we're also going to open out for other voices and other questions. So you can keep your questions coming in the chat as we move through. So I think I'm going to move, because one of the ways of holding presence is also knowing when to be silent. It's another way of being political. It's not just seeking to dominate the space with your own voice. It's knowing that dance between silence and speech. Okay, so we're going to move and we're going to start, who I've only met recently, but already I would call her Dear Janet, because I just saw the way of weaving in this beginning and honouring her work. So she is the founder of Women's Climate Congress. She's now a retired science communicator and businesswoman, and she has a long-standing interest in creating spaces for dialogue around what are divisive public issues. She's also deeply committed to rebalancing public discourse to give women a full and proper place in decision-making at every level. And the importance, which is also really beautiful, when we think of weaving, we think of multiple languages of the political as having meaning story. So she also brings in arts in connecting us to our common humanity without erasure of the diversity. And so she's going to speak briefly about the Congress's vision for a united action on climate change and the Women's Charter that will be the ultimate outcome of this National Congress series of events. So I will hand over to you, Janet, and what I will do is I might just indicate when you get to 5 minutes. Is that okay?
So, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm a little bit conscious that we took up a little bit more time with the beginning and getting going. So I'll try and keep very strict time or less so that we can pick up. So as you've already heard in my introductions, we have been very inspired by the 1915 International Congress of Women. And if you just bear with me a little bit longer on this topic, I'd like to continue the analogy because it's a great case study for our work at the Women's Congress now. In 1915 at the Congress, the women had 2 imperatives. There was a short-term one to end the war, which was going on all around them. And the women proposed that this should be through a process of independent mediation by a council of neutral countries, which was a truly radical idea at the time. And then there was a longer-term imperative, which was to create the conditions for permanent peace, which the women approached via a set of resolutions that were so far-sighted they laid the groundwork for the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and much other international law over the last 100 years. And it's the same for us now. And we face even more dire consequences if we fail. I mean, the war was bad enough, but we've got a possibility of quite catastrophic climate change hanging over us. So our short-term imperative is created by the IPCC Code Red. We must be on a trajectory to stabilise the climate by 2030, or else we're basically done for. Our long-term goal is to make systemic changes to the way we govern ourselves and look after the planet, to create conditions for a sustainable and regenerative future. And as was the case in 1915, these 2 imperatives are inextricably linked. We cannot make progress on one without the other. So in the WCC, we're working on both fronts. To achieve the short-term goal to stabilise the climate, we've proposed an independently mediated process to bring together representative groups with diverse affiliations, interests, expertise, and perspectives to agree national priorities and actions to address climate risk. The idea was at the very heart of the foundation of the WCC, and we subsequently developed the idea as a formal proposal to government. Can I just have, I've got a couple of slides here. So this slide just shows our proposal, which we call Building a Unified National Agreement for Australia's Climate Response. So we think this would provide an opportunity to increase community support and move from individual representations to collaborative problem solving. We submitted this proposal to government in 2020, but there is little appetite within our current adversarial party political system for such a process. This is frustrating because it offers a win-win outcome to a wicked problem and would allow politicians and others who have painted themselves into a corner to come away with pride and honour. After the break, a bit further on, Rhiann Williams, who helped develop this proposal, will give a longer presentation about the principles underlying it, and you will have an opportunity for further discussion. So to achieve the longer term goal, and again taking a lead out of the book of the women in 1915 who developed far-sighted resolutions, we have started work on a Women's Charter for Change. The next slide. WCC has now been an inventive women's thinking and action group for over 2 years. During that time, we have joined, often across great Zoom distances, many minds and ideas, and distilled much about our quintessential women's identity and moral priorities, unheard and unattended by men for centuries. And our determination as women has arisen with us, and we are one half of the Earth's human population. We are parents and relatives, highly responsible for future generations. So we're setting about trying to codify our important values and missions, taking some of our style and pattern from the 1915 Congress and our content from our membership Zoom conversations, First People's knowledge of women and men's business, and their understanding of the first law of Mother Earth, and our reciprocal duties of love and care for the earth. So I'm showing you now the first slide, which just shows you, now this is extremely draft stage because we intend to sort of really put this out and consult widely. So this is just some of our very first sort of ideas. So we're going to have some opening statements, and you can see there this opening statement on the left, we, many women in National Congress assembled, condemn the willful failure of world political unity and action to address global climate heating and the reckless disregard for the inevitable catastrophic impacts on young people today, on future generations, on all life on Earth, is actually based on Resolution 1 from 1915, which I think we're going to put in the chat. And so then we'll have some other general sort of statements about who we are as women and women in the climate Congress and climate crisis, sorry. And I have the next slide, please, Johanna. And then this is just a very preliminary sort of view of some of the ideas that we've got at the moment for what we might put in the resolutions. And there'll be some around decision-making and gender equality for women particularly. And then come the short-term actions to stabilise the climate now. And then come the long-term actions for creating a sustainable, or as we really like to say, regenerative future. So I think I'll leave it at that. You can...
5 minutes. 5 minutes goes quickly, huh?
Yeah.
It's pretty short. You've got a lot to say. So I think we can leave that up whilst I talk for a couple of minutes. I think that's important that people can see this. So thank you so much. And I guess my reflections start with acknowledgement of I really love how you're taking governance seriously, but you're not trying to say we just need to get more women into institutions as they are currently defined. You're also talking about the very redefinition of institutions and the very redefinition of decision making and what we understand the public to be and what we understand the leadership to look like. And I'm really interested in like modeling other forms of leadership and authority, because I think that's often so absent in the kind of more mainstream view. And yet when there is a chance for those stories and those models of leadership to become visible, it's like you sometimes feel, I see with my students sometimes, or other folks, just the light bulb moments of, oh, it's possible to organize, and it's possible to be in relation and to actually make really good decisions and really get things shifting in completely different ways to what is the dominant way. So I'm actually interested in hearing a little bit more of your own journey to leadership, if that felt okay. I mean, if we want to do questions now, I know you want me to ask questions now, and if you want to answer them a little bit, but that's what I'm interested in. I'd like to place your journey and what are your kind of key learning moments, or the key things that really stand out to you about embodying the kind of leadership in the feminine that you do. Muted. Don't know how to unmute you. You're muted, Janet. How do we unmute her? You're muted.
Okay. Maybe we could take the slide off now. Do people?
Yeah.
I'm a mother of 3 very grown-up children and a grandmother of 5, who range in age from 0, coming up for 1 actually, to 9. In my career, I started out as a research scientist doing cancer research, but I sort of found out along the way I'm a bit of a big picture person. I'm a funny mix of detail and big picture. So I changed careers into science writing and editing and built up a business which became quite substantial. But in that work, I did a lot of work with government agencies that were looking at very tricky problems like embryonic stem cell research or genetically modified organisms, where there was a difference in the community. And so I got very interested through that in dialogue and how to create spaces where people come together to talk about these issues that were difficult to talk about. But along the way, in 2006, in Canberra, because I like singing, I joined a Canberra group called A Chorus of Women, and who you have already heard a little bit about this morning. And that was a sort of a blinkers off moment for me, because it joined the dots between the arts and community discourse. And I came to realise that the arts played a really important place to really connect us to our common humanity, which is often missing when you just have discussions of scientists and community people without that input from the arts. And then along the way, I started joining other people in Canberra who were interested in dialogue. Lynn Stevens, who is one of our group here, you'll be seeing her in a minute, was involved with a group called the Dialogue Centre at the ANU. And I joined up with that, and I became interested in other international collaborations. There's something called the Art of Hosting Conversations That Matter, that is an international network of people. So I've just become very interested in along. And I came to know about the International Congress of Women through A Chorus of Women, because we actually did a big choral work that was composed by Glenda Clockley, who you also heard about earlier, in 1915 at the time of the 100th anniversary of the Congress, and which coincided with the 100th anniversary of Anzac. But we were trying to create a different narrative to the Anzac narrative that brought this other story of the world, really, the women going to make peace in The Hague. Again, I don't want to take up too much. Is that sort of enough to be going on? Yeah.
I think, just the importance of our placing and our stories helps to drop in. So we're kind of dropping in, and that's beautiful. And I'm really excited to hear that too, like to hear your journey and to hear how you come to leadership and the things that have mattered to you in this. And what stands out to me is that process really matters. It's not just outcome. Of course, we want outcomes and we want transport, but the part of that is the process and the way we do things, and this dialogical intent and attentiveness, and that it can bring in these multiple forms of communication also matters. And that's also something that I've found in my own work. And that we often ignore process. We don't take seriously, and that's the heart of new forms of governance. So that's wonderful. I'm going to, I think, move to the next speaker. I would invite you to also, everybody present, just to take some beautiful deep breaths so we can drop in more deeply as we go into our journey. Some lovely, beautiful breaths into the nose and out of the mouth, and shaking off any tension so we can really become more and more present as we continue. So we're going to move now to Karen Cain, who I can see. So hopefully she'll come up spotlighted, wonderful, who has a long public sector career leading strategic innovation and developing and implementing policy, and has experience working across communities, particularly in regional areas, to build partnerships to develop and deliver outcomes that reflect what matters to community and government. As the CEO of Latrobe Valley Authority from 2017 until the end of 2021, she led industry and community transition across Latrobe Valley and Gippsland, including in relation to the closure of the Laurann power plant. More recently, Karen has successfully led engagement with the communities across Victoria as part of the Victorian Forestry Plan implementation. So Karen will give us some reflections from her experience with community engagement on transition from fossil fuels. So I'll hand over to you. And again, I'll indicate, maybe just go like this when it's 5 minutes. Okay, perfect.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And hello to everybody who's involved in this fantastic discussion this morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming from today, the Gunai people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the country in which I'm placed today. So look, it's been a really fascinating discussion to this point, and really connected to many of the points that have been made today. It's just so lovely to hear the commonality of things that are really important for the work that we have to do. And I think the weaving part about bringing all of those things together is a fantastic opportunity for today. I will have to say up front that unfortunately I can only stay until 11:30 today. I do have other commitments, but I'm happy to continue in any other conversation into the future as well, if that would be helpful. So I've got a couple of slides which I'm just going to talk to. I've got a lot I can talk to, but I just want to come to a couple of things that I think might be helpful for today's discussion. So this really is about how do we make it work, you know, the really practical side of the work that we need to do in every community around Australia. And that's everywhere from the urban parts of our country to the regional and the remote parts of our country. We really have to develop a very strong movement here at a national level. And I think the Women's Climate Congress is taking a fantastic role in enabling the platform and the bringing people together to be able to do some of this work. I've had the very privilege of being able to do that work in my own community for the last 5 years and continuing to do that. It's here to look at protection of a local forest as part of the state government's forestry plan. But I'll talk about a little bit more about the process which Sarah talked about, which is really important. And Sarah's spot on. Careful process becomes very important if we really want to do this work well. So I might go to the first slide. Thank you. So we've, as an organisation, worked with many people, and that's the privilege I've had, both locally, statewide, nationally and internationally, because knowledge is really important here. And the point about knowledge and understanding and building our knowledge becomes extremely important. So this idea about redefining power has been the work in which we've undertaken for 5 years now, and continuing to do that. So this is about, you know, policy, and politicians and governments are important, but so are so is local knowledge and activity and understanding of knowledge. But it's also across a whole range of people that we need to engage with and talk with and work with and collaborate with. So this idea of bottom up, top down and across collaboration becomes really important as a way of thinking. And what really matters here is about it has to be immediate, midterm and long-term issues that really matter to people, like really matter. How do we know what matters to people without having that conversation? And to Sarah's point, you know, attentiveness and deep listening becomes extremely important as a skill. We talk about it, do we actually know how to do it well? And the skill of that work becomes important for the people who undertake that work or are involved, and learning together about that. But innovation becomes really important, because innovation leads to change in a positive way. One of the things, though, we really do need to understand, whether it's at an international, national, state or local level, is the complexity associated with this. Once you really start to dig deep, it is very complex. It is very complex, and being understanding of that becomes very important. So when we get down to the practical side of this, it is finding out what matters to people, because that's where you start. That's where you start. And it's about being non-judgmental, and that's really important. Listening and understanding and bringing people together on things that matter to people in the short, medium, long term is really the work. And so they reveal opportunities. And I've got not just the usual suspects there, because that cross-community and searching out for people who have knowledge and experience and interest, and it doesn't matter who they are. And for this particular conversation today, for women in particular, who don't normally sometimes come into that space, it's very much, you know, I'd have to say, an older white male regional leadership profile. That's the experience that I've had. So how do we break that down so that we actually bring in a whole lot of people? What this does do, though, is disrupts the leadership paradigm, and that can be tricky. So you've got to be brave here. And some people don't get over that either, by the way, and that's a problem. So the balance here is really, really important. And so it's on practical things and building on people's knowledge and experience, but making evidence-based decisions that are practical actions and real things. They don't have to be big, they can be small, but the aggregation of that over time creates a whole lot of movement and change. So, and they are not just plans, this is real action, people doing things. So I might go to the next slide, please, because I've only got a short amount of time with some very complex ideas here. So it's rethinking that success through those short and long term, and it's about transformation here. If we're not transforming the way we do things, the way we think, the way we view things, the way we work with people to disrupt, you know, the traditional way of governance, then we only stay with the current arrangements. So it's really important to think about that. This idea about reciprocity and respect is is critical, absolutely critical. Doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what role you have, people's knowledge and experience and interest matters. And the weaving then becomes about how we bring all of that together for really practical things. And it's for collective benefit. So what we're trying to challenge here is vested interests and people just interested in their own outcomes or their own organisation's outcomes. Trying to break that down becomes very important to see you can benefit individually as an organisation or as an individual, but we will have collective benefit as well. So it's balancing that up and seeing that's achievable. And lastly, I'll just say that, look, one of the really important bits of work that we've undertaken and done some serious investigation on and had a look nationally and internationally at the research around this is how do you know that there are changes, people are changing their attitude? Actually, how do you know that? You can see it, you can hear it, you can see in what people write or do. And so we've been mapping that. How do you understand the shift? And we've done some really, really good and I think important work on being able to assess that and to see the shift that has occurred, because that actually helps you where you need to go back. Things are all not always perfect. So how do you go back and revisit something? And a lot of monitoring and asking people, you know, how's it going? But it is absolutely about changes in attitude and behaviour and actions. And systems becomes a really important change focus here, because if people don't change their systems, we end up with the same systems that have created the situation we've got at the moment. So we do need to try and shift systems. And then those leadership structures are really important at a local and more broader level as well. So we're actually starting to make inroads into government policy in this state now, based on the work that we've done over the last 5 years. And we are influencing policy change and the way that government operates and the way policy is being developed. Doing some fantastic work in the forestry area now associated with that. And in partnership with traditional owners, which I'm so pleased is happening, true partnership in terms of working together every day. So I'm just I have to say it's been an amazing learning for me. And what has been inspiring for me this morning is that we and from what Auntie Matilda said is, I'm really very privileged to be able to do this work and contribute. So I might just stop there and
Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It did take us deeper into what this might look like. So we also need, we had the big systems, ethical thinking, and then the actual practices of how do you embed institutionally and in new forms of governance these ethical commitments and this commitment to deep listening and this commitment to multiple knowledges and to unlikely subjects and subjects who are normally not in institutional spaces and political spaces. So my question to you actually revolves around that, because from my own experience, which is what drew me to working with kind of raced women and marginalized women, of experiencing feeling invalid and that I didn't have a valid voice and that I couldn't be welcome in these formal spaces of theory or of politics. And so a lot of my work actually kind of happens in the invisible spaces prior, with women working to unlearn these internalized deficit thinking, to work through the kinds of traumas that you are faced with at the front line of climate and other kind of violations, and to really build on the strengths and the knowledges. So my question is, what kinds of processes do you put in place to get that women who otherwise might not be present to be present and to come present feeling that they have something to contribute?
That's a great question. Great question, Sarah. So so networks become really important. So this is about people who are in a safe space. So working through networks where individuals are in a safe space. So people that they trust. Yeah. So we work through networks, and it's really important. So what you're saying is for people, and particularly women, who don't have the confidence or have had bad experiences about working with institutions or with government or with more formal arrangements, it's very difficult. So I'll give you a very good example of that. We're about to go out for the next 3 days next week to talk to a whole lot of people in my community about a protected area of forest that sits right here where I live. And we've worked through all of the networks in the community. And we are going to do that in very informal ways, but formal ways as well. And people get to choose how they want to engage. We're not determining that. So the community has actually got all of its networks together and determined how they want to have that conversation. Now, that's really important. But again, it's about how you create an inviting, non-threatening, respectful conversation, and where that's placed is as important as how. And that we've been working on how we organise for that for weeks now. But me meeting with individual people who are organisers in our community who understand that, and these are women, and saying to them, how can we reach out to people in your networks that might want to come in and talk in a safe way, because it's the safety is the issue here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think, our mindfulness of who's present but who's not and how we get them present is really important too in these processes.
Yes, absolutely.
What we need to do. Yeah, it's beautiful. Okay, so I am now going to move to our third speaker. So I think we're switching spotlights. I will, and again, whilst we're switching, I would invite you to come to presence with your breath. Maybe taking your deep breaths and just really feeling into the earth, the country that holds you beneath your feet, that holds you in your chair, so that we can kind of drop now into our third layer. So I'd like to welcome Christina Talacco, who is the chair of the centre-right organisation Coalition for Conservation, a movement for conservatives who support decarbonisation and protection of the environment. She has a corporate legal background and extensive experience in executive boards and management of not-for-profit associations, including various energy and renewables boards, including the think tank Beyond Zero Emissions. In 2016, she completed the executive program Women Empower at Harvard. Christina is also a businesswoman and founded Salisbury Fine Foods, manufacturing allergen-sensitive foods to Australia and export, and is one of the owners of the organic foods retail stores Naked Foods. She is passionate about the environment, female empowerment, and diversity. Chris will speak about her work with Coalition for Conservation and conservative perspectives on action on climate change. Welcome. So I might just raise my hand at 5 minutes. They'll put me back on the spotlight around that time. Okay, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. And thanks, Janet, and the whole team behind the National Congress of Women, who have been, following quite closely their great work. So thanks for inviting me to be here this morning. In the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to start always, as I do, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, community, sea, paying my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I hope the volume is high enough for everybody. Maybe do a sign to tell me, is it okay? Okay. As Sara introduced me, I'm very involved in the environmental front through Coalition for Conservation, which is quite a different organization from lots of other environmental organizations, because we are quite focused in shifting the conservatives and changing their mindset in terms of climate change. I know that I've heard from Matilda that this won't happen overnight, and that resonated a lot with me. Also heard the word bipartisanship, which is what we're trying to achieve long term and also hopefully medium term. And Karen mentioned collaboration. She mentioned trust and a safe space. So all of these things resonate with what we do. But for those who are not familiar with who we are and what we do, we are a registered charity here in Australia, although we also do some work internationally. And what we advocate is for an effective climate agenda that aligns with conservative values. So we engage conservatives, or here we call them center rights, or the right of politics. We engage them with other experts around the globe and here in Australia, trying to support each other on efforts to reduce emissions and also move towards net zero economy and protect the environment. So in Australia, we work very closely to the National and the Liberal parties. The focus is to provide them with information, with experiences that will transform, in a way, their views on environment. And ultimately, we want, of course, all of this to lead to positive action and sensible policy. So we work very much on the premises that conservative values and conservation work always together in tandem, which is something that has been done very successfully in the UK in recent decades, with their Conservative Party, with the Tories. It started obviously with Margaret Thatcher a while ago. She was, and great that she's a woman, she was the first prominent political leader to really warn the world about the dangers of climate change. She has outlined a strategy for the UK to deal with what she, I suppose, recognized as the prospect of this irretrievable damage to our atmosphere, to our oceans, and to the earth. So, in terms of today's topic, redefining power, and I always like starting with Margaret Thatcher, because I'm a great admirer of what her work and, her legacy in the UK. But these impacts of climate change, as we know, they're very much a result of actions by the world's, dare I say that, the most affluent and powerful. But yet the damage, as we see, seem to be felt by the most vulnerable people in the poorest parts of the world. And women seem to be very impacted by climate change, probably more than men, especially in the more undeveloped countries, because, well, they're the primary gatherers of food, water, fuel, the dominating subsistence farming women, their caregiving, their cleaning, all of that relies heavily on national resources. So there is an imbalance when it comes to gender, when we talk about climate change, and that's highly recognized nowadays. And around the globe, I think many of these communities that have contributed the least to climate change are obviously bearing the greatest, brunt of it, I suppose. So we're seeing that even on Australia's doorstep, on our backyard, in the Pacific Islands, in the Torres Strait Islands, where they seem quite fearful of diminishing their sea level rises, and despite their own minimal impacts on global warming, they're suffering. So back to our organization, the C4C approach, we want to redefine power by working to reshape the way that decision makers or policy makers think on climate change generally. And that's a very gradual process, and it involves trust and building relationships and demonstrating clearly an understanding of the fundamental values and goals that we want to achieve. So we've started a lot with education and educational programs for parliamentarians because we think that was a key to really building leaders who have the necessary understanding and confidence to lead on climate. We play a very key role in providing this expertise and networks. And the reliability of the information usually for politicians depends on which side of politics it comes from. So we're very careful to provide them with, information that comes from the Conservatives themselves, so that they rely upon that with less suspicion, I suppose. So we're very, very good at providing that type of information. We run a very good parliamentary engagement program. We provide the opportunity for legislators in Australia to participate internationally in groups and forums, roundtables, whether they're private or public, discussions. And so they get together with other more progressive thinkers or progressive conservatives who can really powerfully influence them in their commitments to climate change. We started seeing a really good and a real momentum in building the work that we've been doing probably about 2 years ago, but mainly last year when we took 7 MPs from the National Liberal parties to attend COP26 in Glasgow. We managed to put together a fantastic program for them. And we thought that this was probably the best way to fast track changes in attitudes and understandings, to really immerse those politicians that are usually very much in their own bubble here in Australia, immerse them in environments and in events, international events, where they could experience these impacts firsthand. So they participated in different events, they met different people, they exchanged a lot of information. They've learned a lot, and they could observe these climate negotiations. It was a very transformative experience for them. So they came back very recharged, very different, and very moved by what they saw. And I think they actually brought all of their experience to the party rooms, and they're trying to make different, to have an influence now. So they heard firsthand accounts of the impact of climate change at COP, of course, from countries from around the world. They learned from scientific experts. They mingled with so many conservative policymakers who are facing similar problems and are actually tackling them in a better way. So we have built relationships with you in the UK with some partners like the Conservative Environment Network, which operates a bit like us. They've created this climate caucus within the Tories. And we hosted what we call the Global Conservative Climate Summit alongside COP. It was attended by Canadians, the UK, the US, Australia, European countries, Latin American countries, many other countries from Asia. And it was a great interaction and discussions on problems and solutions, which then created a prolonged, sort of like a group that they belong to now, and they can actually all talk to each other when they want to deal with things.
We're just reaching we've reached the 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah. I'll wrap up. I mean, there's so much that we've done this year. We've put forward a lot of submissions to the government, but really what we're trying to do is reshape the attitudes. Ultimately, we want to redefine power in relation to climate change, but it's a formidable task, as we all know. So it's not something that will happen today. It's happening in a process. But we're seeing very positive outcomes, and we want to influence and influence all of these MPs in a positive way rather than through fear and negative experiences. So our long-term scenario here is to inspire them, bring knowledge, and create this united commitment and a group of really good climate champions for Australia. It's an ambitious plan, but we're doing it.
Thank you so much for this contribution. This is the contribution that is most other to me because of my own lineages and traditions. So I'm sitting with that unsettledness. I think it's important, right, to sit with our differences. And it just brings me, in one of my last workplaces in the UK, there was some corruption happening, and it was myself and a colleague who came from an army security background, he's a conservative, who stood up, because we both had this really strong ethical commitment. And it really surprised me. He became like part of a kinship network, and even though we had so many differences, but we had this ethical commitment to clarity and transparency and to kind of walking your talk, and this corruption thing was happening. So, well, we both have to speak about it. And so we ended up speaking about it. So I'm really interested, and we are running out of time as well. So I'm trying to be quicker, but I'm actually really interested in hearing about like your ethical commitments and what brings you to this, like how amidst the kind of conservative tradition, it takes you to this the care and the conservation. So something about that would be lovely to hear.
It's really not a head scratcher, and I'm not sure where in Australia we lost that sense that conservation and conservatism should, in essence, are the same values, which, it's, as you said, in the UK is quite transparent. I think what happened here was it became very divisive, the topic of climate change, as we know, and environment consequently. But one thing that every single person in the conservative movements, everywhere I go, agree is that we should preserve our environment, that we should look after, our fauna, our flora, our atmosphere, our oceans. This is something that no one can disagree with, and that's where we actually find some a common place to start the discussion. If we started talking about climate change, which seems intangible and difficult for a lot of politicians to actually grasp, then we go down to the day-to-day lives of people and what we want to leave for our families and the future of our countries and the generations ahead, which is very much a conservative thing. You want to leave, the environment untouched or in a better or equal format that you've experienced. So when we come to these basic principles of conservatism, and we put it this way to our politicians, I think then they detach those preconceptions that they have with climate change being something intangible that they find it difficult to grasp, or in a way find it politically divisive, to a common ground where everybody can agree with. So it's really all about the narratives that you use and how fast or slow you want them to. It's a slow process of changing people's beliefs and how they think and how they've been programmed to think. Unfortunately, maybe not even their decision, but it's the environment where they live politically or the factions that they experience. And they tend to listen to only one source of information. So we're trying to bring, the messenger is really important. So if it's a conservative messenger talking about natural environment, the importance of natural capital, the importance of conservation, it's different than being a confrontational environmentalist who they believe then have completely different values to them. So they won't listen. Yeah.
Yeah, super interesting. And I just think that foregrounds, there are different routes, as in roots, journey ways, and as in roots in a tree in which we do this journey, right? And how we bring people along and perhaps create the spaces for these kinds of dialogues and shared action. Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're now going to move to Laurann. I hope I'm saying this right, and Alex. And I'm sorry if I'm not. I'm just going to quickly introduce them both. So Alex is a strategic designer, arts and cultural policy expert, and cultural advocate and advisor. Trained as a historian, she has a diverse background in public policy, strategic thinking, and cultural heritage management, linked by a primary focus on people, culture, and values. And Laurann, hope so, has worked in the health sector through most of her career as a clinical psychologist, manager, policymaker, and researcher. More recently, she's been working as a volunteer in her local community, supporting the recovery efforts following the bushfires in 2019-20, which has led to an increasing activism in the climate space. Laurann and Alex will present their proposal for the formation of a parliamentary women's caucus, aiming to take the vital issue of climate change above the fray of political partisanship to find solutions that work for all our communities. So I will hand over to you both. And because there's two of you, we'll still try to do the 5 minutes, and I might just wave when I come back in. Okay.
Thank
Wonderful.
you, Sarah. And I'm Alex, and I'll start off. And I'm speaking to everyone from beautiful Laurann country. It's around emerging. And thank you to Dr.
Alex, you're a bit quiet. You're a bit quiet. Can you speak?
Thank you. How about this? Is this better?
No, it needs to be a bit higher.
Everything. This is ridiculous. All right. I'll come even further so you can see really close up. How's that? Is that okay?
A bit better, a bit better.
All right. And
Speak up, yeah, speak up, yeah.
And I thank Dr. Matilda House, who said we have to do something for the future. And that reminds me of a statement that Laurann and I used in the document we sent to the women parliamentarians from Mae Jamison, who said the future never just happened, it was created. So you've heard the introduction from Sarah. I have also been a committed feminist my entire life, as Laurann has been as well. This is what we're
Even louder if you can, Alex, as loud as you can, yeah.
Right, I have no idea why this is not working so well. Sorry. Okay, this is another way of looking at power and leadership, and it's a piece in the whole jigsaw puzzle of power and communities. The problem as we saw it was there's been a failure of successive Australian Commonwealth governments. Women's voices haven't been heard, strengths could be better leveraged, politics have been trumping policies, and there's been the need for coherent and longer term policy approaches. Basically, the need to reach across the party divide. There has been a very documented decline in public trust in democracy and in Parliament. So we thought, what can we do? We actually like to make some action happen. So we need a women's climate caucus in federal Parliament. This was a proposition that we thought we needed to go to members in Parliament with, and it's to establish a cross-party women's climate caucus, which would work to do several things. One is to apply internal pressure, to generate actionable proposals, and to communicate the need and the priority and the urgency to change, and give Parliament a capacity really to shift the conversation and the culture and to influence the basis for decision making. So we did some research on shared policy areas in Australia and other countries that could be springboards for collaborative action. Are you able to hear me? Good. I'm about ready to climb into the screen now. Okay, so we researched some shared policy areas, and I must say we plodded through acres of policy documents of all the parties and all the independents. We did this for you, everyone. We did this for you, acres of it. And we did find that there were some areas of shared policy and interest and concern that we call possible springboards for collaborative action. And they were examples in new jobs in renewables and in financial services, or regional packages for agriculture and forestry. I do have to say there were large areas of non-shared policy concerns, like the biggies of health, transport, and some infrastructure. But leaving those aside, there are other areas of shared interest and concern and policy. So all parties do share some of these concerns and strategies. And the imperative for us in having a Women's Climate Caucus in the Federal Parliament was to find points of agreement and build from that. As earlier speakers have been pointing out earlier this morning, you've got to find areas of agreement, get some shared ownership and build from that. So then in November 2021, we approached our local Labor women parliamentary reps with a very strong message about the need for them to step up and lead. And we requested a meeting to discuss the proposition for a new caucus. So we discussed it with Alicia Payne, who's the Labor member for the Canberra electorate, Christy McBain, who's the Labor member for Eden Monaro, and Senator Katie Gallagher, who's the senator for Labor senator for Canberra. Cautious interest. They did note that there was divisiveness in the polity, which we have noticed. However, they did agree we could move it along. And so we suggested that we refer some research to the Parliamentary Library, which can only do research upon request from parliamentarians, not from the public or any NGOs, which they agreed to do. And so therefore, Laurann and I worked on a very specific brief of research areas. And that brief included things like, are there other women's caucuses around the country, around the world? Is there a specific gendered approach to climate change? How might we move ahead? What are the priorities? So after a series of reminders, we were sent this wonderful research report last week, and it has much excellent material with links to many other sites and documents, and we will extract those links for people and put them in a document. We just can't put the entire document up on site, but we will do this. Now, the advisors are caught up in the election campaign and clearly don't want to move this along at the moment. As we're all experiencing this, we are experiencing a very traditional campaign at the moment, by the major parties at least, and by the mainstream media, so it's adversarial. So what do we do next? This is when I now hand over to Laurann.
Okay, thank you, Alex. It's been a really interesting process because I think there are already examples. So the Friends of Climate Change in the Parliament, who already talk across the divide to look at how we can come together on issues around climate. But I think that the real difficulty in trying to pursue something that actually takes seriously the importance of governments and the absolute fundamental nature of the legislation that actually surrounds us in terms of climate change is creating an impetus and a shift in the way that people believe that they relate to the problems that actually exist in our communities. And the work that people have been talking about this morning, so Karen and Christina and Sara, recognising the importance of the way that the impetus and the imperative for change must build up from the bottom and must come up and demand of our parliamentarians that they take their long-term jobs seriously about the way that we actually protect our nation and that we actually create a future for our nation. And I think the point that Alex and I are probably up to at the moment is thinking about how do we actually now create that sense of a government that has ambition and has a real sense of the huge role that it could play in the whole of world climate policy and energy policy because of the nature of our country and because of the way that we can actually work. And so our frustration, I think, is that it's very easy for any formal process just to say we're too busy, it's not quite important enough, it's not really on our agenda. And so our next challenge, I think, is trying to find the ways that we can actually move the issue of climate change not just in around the feet of all of our parliamentarians, but actually onto their desks and into their discussions with their colleagues and all of us, so that we have a long-term, ambitious, directed agenda for managing this huge climate challenge. So I think I'll stop there, Sarah.
Lovely. Perfect. It's hard then with 5 minutes, blimey. It's difficult.
Yeah.
So you did wonderfully.
We've been practicing.
It's so interesting. So I co-chair the Women's Caucus for the Australian National Political Studies Association. So it's very interesting hearing you and the attempt to do that in the parliamentary setting as well. And what we found is, I mean, some women don't come near us because they don't identify that as an important issue around being women, and they're also, and it's not just a feminist, there are some who are feminists, some who are gender, some who don't, they are women who happen to be political scientists. And I think what really interests me, both from my own practice as well as hopefully it will be resonant for others, is what have been the kind of greatest learnings about how you create those bridges across the parliamentary divide? And if you give us any insight about that, that would be wonderful.
Now, can you hear me when I said
Yes.
Oh, good. I've mucked around with things, so great. Sorry about that earlier. Greatest learnings. Well, we're still learning, and we are drawing on our learning in the past about walking the corridors of power, quite frankly, which is why we've targeted in on this narrow focus. This is what we think we can do and how we can do it. I'm really I do know that you've got to enthuse and energize with doing something positive. I mean, part of the pitch is that, look, there are 90 other countries with women's caucuses. None refer specifically to climate change issues. There's a huge opportunity for Australia to lead after being so laggard for so long. And this is the way we need to do this. This could be a commitment by the new parliament when it meets. It's a great selling point. And I do know that you need selling points. There are simple hooks, great things to make them feel good about themselves, and to lead into that. And I think that's the way it should be presented when the new parliament meets. Laurann?
Yeah, I think what I've learned is, as what other speakers have said, and it's just a real respect and recognition for the complexity of trying to make shifts in this direction where you are redefining power, you're redistributing the way that decisions are made. And my impatience isn't going to make that much difference. So I think it's that recognition that we have to find a way of gathering the enthusiasm and the trust and the coalitions and the networks, and finding a way to feed all of those things into the bigger question, the bigger issue. And so it's about being brave enough to come out and talk about that. Sarah, as you were saying, you've got to stand up. You've just got to stand up.
And find areas of, find something, anything, doesn't really matter what it is, something that people across the divide can agree on. And then you build on that, and build on that, and build on that.
I love the idea of patience. Because I love the idea of different temporalities, that when we redesign governance and we bring in new subjects and we do it differently and we feminize the political, we also have to take seriously cycles, and we have to take seriously different times and rhythms. Because the dominant form is just rapid and there's no sense of cycles and acknowledging when it's time to really sit and hold presence, when it's time to be, really rapid and fast. And I think I love that. And the gathering metaphor, we have to gather, right? We have to gather together and be discerning in our gathering, but with an attentiveness to how we then can create something with that. I really like these. Okay, that's wonderful. We have one more speaker. We are going over a bit, but it's worthwhile, and I hope everyone's feeling okay and is still breathing and is still feeling connected to the earth below you, to Madre Tierra, to country and that holding, and is hydrated. I'm keep drinking lots of water. So our final speaker is Kirsten Anchor, who is initially trained as a lawyer, but most of her work has been centered around family and community while she lived away from Australia for many years. She's very interested in conflict resolution and mediation, especially in the community context, and is a founding member of the Women's Climate Congress. Kirsten will speak about the Neighbourly Conversations initiative of the Congress. So I'll hand over to you. You're on mute. Somebody has to mute Kirsten, yeah, she needs to.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I noticed that I have a bit of a halo, which has nothing to do with my virtue, but just some serendipitous placement of my computer out here. I was going to start by doing a little bit of introduction on the issue of polarization around the topic of climate, but Sarah's introduction and her eloquent development of the idea of strengthening our ability to have meaningful conversations and to listen deeply across difference, I think is a wonderful introduction to this project of neighbourly conversations. So Women's Climate Congress is looking at a number of projects to promote discussions that do make a difference. Janet has spoken about the macro, about the mediated process. But I'd like to talk about the neighbourly conversations, which is more on a micro level. However, it's a project that appeals strongly to me because it ticks a number of boxes. It's about having honest conversations. It's about creating an environment where people may change their perspective. It's an invitation to improve communication amongst women working together on this issue, but also between politicians and their constituents. It models a way of talking about difficult topics in a meaningful way, and for these reasons, it seems to me to be an opportunity to build trust. So it's only a small project, or sorry, each iteration is a small one, but at the same time, as Matilda said to us, we can't do everything, but it's important to do something. Also, from little seeds, big things grow, and also to build trust and connection, it's good to start 2 people at a time. So neighbourly conversations begin with 2 politicians from neighbouring electorates of different political parties, and then we add women from both electorates of diverse political views. We also had 2 facilitators from Wicked Elephants, Deb Collins and Caress, I've forgotten around the name, but they're in the audience today. And then also a participant from Women's Climate Congress. So we're limiting the numbers to about 12. This small group meets for an hour, and in the time of COVID, we've been meeting over Zoom. The Chatham House rule applies in order to, or mostly to, create a space where politicians feel comfortable diverging from a party script. The format is a circle conversation in which participants respond to prompts from the facilitator, and everyone has equal time to speak. So some examples of prompts might be to mark on the Zoom whiteboard how you feel about climate change, how strong that feeling is, or to speak briefly about what concerns you most, or what is the world that you would like to see. So in this environment, politicians and constituents are on the same level. There is no audience for declamatory speeches or repetition of party platforms. There is no time for attacking questions. So rather, it's an opportunity to listen, to hear, and to speak about values and feelings in an authentic way and from the heart. Maybe for some politicians, this is an unusual experience, and also for some constituents who may see themselves as having, for the first time, as having the same right to contribute to a discussion as a politician. So we've trialled the process and it demonstrated its potential. The feedback that we've received is that the participants, including the politicians, have come out of the process with a different perspective. So now we would really like to roll it out. We've held off because until after the election, or we're holding off until after the election. But once that result is in, it's been suggested to us that we focus on newly elected MPs who generally have had very little contact with other parties until they actually sit in Parliament. Also, this process may be an opportunity not only to speak about climate change, but also to speak about how we would like our MPs to behave in Parliament. And this process may be something of a model. So the next steps that we are planning are, first of all, to follow up with new MPs once the election result is in. Secondly, to continue to reach out to diverse groups of women, the ones that Cain described as not the usual suspects, because it's really important that the politicians don't feel recognize that these views come from that these views are held widely in their electorate. We would also like to talk to Karen about the work that she's doing of mapping shifting opinions as we continue to experiment with this process. I think that would be really important information to gather. And also we want to call on Women's Climate Congress members to contact us if you would like to have a conversation with your MP. And so I'll stop there, Sara.
That's a lovely way to end. I know we have, we've gone over timings. I don't know, feminized time is also different, I think, because we have to go with where things go and what needs to be said and shared in that moment. I really love it how even the way you presented this kind of dropped me into the heart, actually. And the idea of that in these kinds of practices, the connection of spirit, heart and head is really important. And that is also another way in which we reimagine and re-embody the political and the way we kind of come to listen to each other, and the attentiveness to the facilitation again process, and that actually the art of this facilitation is an art, and there can be many different lineages, but we so often don't take that seriously. So my feeling is you ended on kind of some questions and how you would like to learn from the transition work that has been done by Karen. So I thought that was actually a nice way to close in the sense that there was these connections through the sharing of the stories and the experiences between the panelists, and hopefully then, threads that were also with the participants, like I was looking a little bit at the chat and a couple of questions, and for my own self as well, in my own understanding of this practice and what is being collectively and plurally co-created around kind of a women's alliance and collaboration that reimagines governance and politics itself. So I don't know, Janet, what would you like us to do now?
Yeah, I think we probably do need to regroup and have our little break. But I would like to really thank you very much, Sara, for your moderation of this session. That's been absolutely marvellous. I'm sure everyone agrees, and also to all the other speakers that we've had who've all brought such deep thoughts and their whole selves to this conversation, which has been marvellous. So thank you. So it's actually 11:50, and it was always going to be a bit of a challenge this morning's session. So I think we'll take a break, and we'll try and come back at 12. So that means, and then we'll hear from Rianne. There's still a lot of time after that to, especially if we sneak a tiny bit out of the lunch break, to hear from you all again, to have your voice. We're going to have some breakout groups, in fact, after Rianne speaks. So you will be able to bring your voices into this conversation. So yes, let's go and have a little shake off, go to the loo, have a cup of tea. Johanna's just going to, while you're just regrouping your thoughts, Johanna's going to put on a few of the photos from Hillary's visual petition, and then we'll put up a little sign to the break, and we'll come back at 12 to hear from Rianne. So thank you very much again, and thank you, Sara.
Skip this bit, which will give us a few minutes, which we just so we get questions in the chat. And we'll discuss